what we call the physical world is nothing but a headset inside consciousness. So to just see how dramatic the change is, most of us, myself included, think of ourselves as tiny little objects in a vast space-time, billions of light years across. The nearest galaxy is 2.4 million light years away, and that's the nearest galaxy. And they go off. So I'm just this little tiny, tiny, trivial little chunk of matter in this vast billions of light years across universe, space-time. That's the way I thought. And now what I'm realizing is the other way around. Space-time is a tiny little data structure in my consciousness, and I create it on the fly as I need. So that's how outrageous what I'm saying is. To be very, very explicit and maybe to shock people, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but I'll say this: neurons do not exist when they're not perceived, because nothing inside space-time exists when it's not perceived. Space-time itself does not exist when it's not perceived. It is only a data structure that exists when you create it in your consciousness. That's the shocking, and that's what I've been having a difficult time emotionally wrapping myself around. Intellectually, I'm there. The math has completely convinced me. Our best science convinced me this is true. We'll see when my emotions come along for the ride.
Donald, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thanks for having me.
What would you say the central question that's been driving your research the past few decades has been?
Ah, well, I guess a couple little intertwined themes. One is, do we see reality as it is? Because my background is in visual perception and perception more generally. So that's a really interesting question. What is the relationship between perception and reality? And the other interacting theme is, what is consciousness and how is conscious experience related to everyday life in the physical world, and neuroscience. So those have been the two big themes that I've been pursuing, and they turn out that they seem to be interacting. The answer to one seems to affect the answer to the other.
You're pursuing a couple of quite easy questions there, I have to say. What's underneath this search? Before we started recording, you mentioned, you come from quite a religious when you grew up in quite a religious background. What's been underneath this desire for truth and this search?
Yes, my father was for several years a fundamentalist Christian minister, Holy Ghost, holy roller kind of thing, and so I was exposed to that. Uh, but then in at school, I was being exposed to science classes, and they were saying contradictory things. In church, the Earth was 4,000 years old. In science class, it was millions or billions of years old, and that's not easy to reconcile. And so I realized that there was this big conflict. And as a teenager, it's hard to, at least for me, it was hard to figure out how to reconcile these two things. But I decided that I needed to do that, and I wanted to understand, the nature of consciousness and the nature of human beings. What are we just machines? That came to be the question that I formulated for myself. Are we just machines, or is there something more? The spiritual side seemed to say there was something more. The science seemed to say we were just machines. And so I thought, that's if the science convinces me that we're just machines, then maybe the spiritual stuff is, there's not much to save there. But if there's something about us that's beyond machines, then that's interesting. It doesn't mean the spiritual side that I was taught was right, but it means that there could be some parts of it that could be saved. And so that was the question I was asking myself as a teenager. Are we just machines? And I was taking programming classes. This was back when programming was fairly brand new. I started programming in 1974. And so that was, we didn't even have punch cards. We had to use cards that we bubbled in by hand with pencils and so forth. But I wrote programs. So I was aware of the programming, and then I worked at Hughes Aircraft as an undergraduate at UCLA. I worked at Hughes Aircraft programming military microprocessors in machine code. Again, starting off with punch cards, but eventually the miracle of floppy disks came around. So I was into the computer, and I realized that it was artificial intelligence was what I really needed to understand. Could we build human AIs that were equivalent to us, that were us? And and so I found out about research going on at MIT in the artificial intelligence lab, and with David Marr, and of course Marvin Minsky was the head of the lab, and it was an incredible group there. So I was fortunate enough to go to MIT in 1979, be in the artificial intelligence lab, and also the what's now the brain and cognitive science department. So I was looking at the human side with the neuroscience and the machine side with the artificial intelligence, as were many other people, right? That's what MIT was doing. And so that was how I began to try to, tackle this problem. Are we just machines? And intellectually, you have to be honest. Yeah, you just have to say, I don't know. And let's go wherever the science and logic lead us. One thing I could not do was something I had been taught in my particular spiritual training. I'm not saying this is true of all spiritual training, but in my particular spiritual training, was we were taught that we had been told the absolute truth and you should not listen to anything else. And I knew that that couldn't be right. That wasn't right. So I needed to take a more open mind and say, sure, I need to listen to what the spiritual side says, but there's no absolute truths here. And it's so that was the one thing where I clearly departed from what I'd been taught. And I think it was absolutely critical to, you have to think for yourself, and go wherever the evidence, reason, and logic will take you. And so I did that and did my PhD at MIT on a specific problem. You can't just tackle the big questions. You're not going to get your PhD because you won't get anything done. So I tackled the question of how do we see in 3D and recognize objects. I tackled one aspect of that, seeing in three dimensions and recognizing objects, which is of course still an interesting and open problem. To get self-driving cars, that's what we need. Are computers that can see through cameras and see in 3D and recognize what they're doing, so they don't run over people and don't run into parked cars on the road and so forth. So I was grappling with that problem in my dissertation, but what I realized was that doing that gave me a real deeper understanding of the mathematics that underlies perception, right? Most of us have no idea what's going on under the hood when you just open your eyes and look around you. It looks like, well, you just take a picture of what's out there. How hard could it be? It's a camera, it takes a picture. What? Give me breaks. There's nothing to it. Well, if that's all there was to it, we would have self-driving cars already that could see, and we wouldn't be having the slow rollout of autonomous vehicles that we're having. Much slower than people expected. It's really, really hard. And then when you realize that, you have billions of neurons and trillions of synapses that are involved just in vision. Again, that's not just a camera. That's a pretty expensive piece of hardware that's working there. So that wakes you up to what's going on, that it's not just a picture taking process, it's in some sense a construction process. You're getting an image at the eye, which, your eye has maybe 130 million photoreceptors. So you can think of it as like a 130 million megapixel, 130 megapixel camera. But if you look at the output of the camera, it's just a bunch of numbers. You don't see, a person riding a bicycle and tables and chairs. You just see a bunch of numbers. It's this bright at this location. It's this color at this location. You've got to take all those numbers and turn it into a visual world that you can actually navigate. So that's the real trick. And so I came to terms with how much is going on there, that it's a construction process, not just a mere photographic process. And then that raised the question, oh, if it's a construction process, how accurate is the construction? Is it a reconstruction of reality, or is it a de novo construction that maybe is unrelated to objective reality? And the latter seemed unlikely to me, but I just needed to prove it. And I just needed to understand, okay, so of course the idea was we reconstruct reality. That was what I was taught. That's what we believed at MIT. that it's a construction process, but it's a reconstruction of reality. But then as I started, thinking about evolution and other things, I began to wonder about that. It's like, evolution does things on the cheap, fast and cheap. Where you're trying to save calories and save time. So you're going to use heuristics and shortcuts. You're going to cheat. Uh, and so maybe the idea then was, well, maybe we cheat sometimes, but most of the time on the important stuff, we're reconstructing reality. So I thought about that. And I went back and forth, and I finally came to the conclusion that it seemed unlikely with what I knew about perception research and from the AI point of view, that any of our constructions were the truth. But in 2008, I decided I need to settle this with evolution. I need to actually ask a technical question. What is the probability that evolution by natural selection has shaped any sensory system of any organism to ever see any aspect of objective reality truly? What's the probability of that? Clean technical question. And when Darwin formulated his theory in the 19th century, he didn't formulate it as a mathematical theory. So Darwin couldn't have answered that question with mathematical precision. But John Maynard Smith and others in the 1970s took Darwin's ideas and used evolution. What they came up with was evolutionary game theory. They used game theory and evolution together to create the field of evolutionary game theory. A very, very powerful mathematical theory. So Darwin's ideas are now mathematically precise. And so we can now ask the technical question. What's the probability that any sensory system has been shaped to see the truth, some aspect of the truth at all? And I went into it thinking, well, probably there'll be problems because, you know, it, getting the truth takes a lot of time and a lot of calories. So we're probably going to be doing things cheaply and quickly. And so we'll probably be, approximating the truth, but not really getting the truth. And that was sort of what I expected going into it. And I got a couple of wonderful graduate students, Brian Marion and Justin Mark, to work with me, and some others. I mean, Chetan Prakash and others work with me, Manish Singh. So it's not just me. It was a bunch of group of people with mathematics. And we went at it. And what we discovered when we actually did the mathematics and the simulations was, sure, yeah, there are selection pressure to do things fast and cheap, and that will compromise reality, But that wasn't the real. What we discovered was this: the payoff functions. When you in evolution, you think about it as like a game, and as you're playing the game, you're competing with others, and the point of this game is to as reproductive success, right? You're trying, you don't get to the next level of the game yourself, but your offspring, your genes go to the next level of the game if you succeed. And so the idea was that there are these payoff functions that govern effectively how many points you get in the game of life. And if you get more points than the competition, then you have a greater probability of having offspring in the next generation. So it's the payoff functions that are the critical thing. And if you're going to be shaped to see the truth, then the payoff functions must have information about that truth if they're going to shape you. So that became the clean technical question. What's the probability that a fitness payoff function has information about structures that could be in the world? Like, now it gets a little mathematical, like total orders, partial orders, metrics, topologies, measurable structures. There are all sorts of mathematical structures that you could imagine that the world has. And in each case, you can ask the technical question, what's the probability that a randomly chosen payoff function would actually be what we call homomorphism, or contain information about that structure? And the answer is zero. The probability is zero. In case after case, you look at it, the probability is zero. And in fact, even for things that are sort of close to homomorphisms, in many cases, the probability is vanishingly small. So that was a shock to the system. We haven't been shaped to see the truth. And that shock then has reverberations for the problem of consciousness. Because what it means is what we're perceiving when we perceive a spatial temporal world, a 3D of space, one dimension of time, and we're seeing physical objects in space and time and so forth. We're not seeing reality as it is. With probability one, we're not seeing reality as it is. That's whatever that is if you buy Darwin's theory. And so that means that space-time isn't fundamental. Space-time is just a form of our perceptions. And physical objects inside space-time aren't fundamental. They also are just the way I think about it now is it's like a virtual reality headset that evolution gave us to play the game of life, right? If you're trying to play a game like VR, Grand Theft Auto, or something like that with your friends, what you're really doing in this metaphor is you're toggling millions of voltages in some supercomputer, right? But if you had to do that, if you had to toggle the voltages in the precise sequence, you couldn't win the game. You would lose the game. Someone who just has a virtual reality headset with a steering wheel and dashboard and gas pedal and so forth is going to win over someone who sees the truth and is toggling voltages. And so I think what evolution is teaching us is what we evolved was not an insight into truth, but a VR headset. Space-time is our headset. So instead of consciousness and its physical substrate, which is which most conscious researchers are thinking about, is consciousness and its physical substrate. I think about it as consciousness and its physical headset. And that's a complete change because if the brain is the physical substrate of consciousness, that means the brain is fundamental. Something not conscious is fundamental, and consciousness is arising out of it. But if we take evolution by natural selection seriously, then the brain is merely an icon in our headset. It's not the truth, and it has no causal powers. So I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I love neuroscience, and I study neuroscience, and I've done joint work on fMRI and EEG studies of the brain, and then lots of computational modeling and so forth. I'm very much into the brain, and I love cognitive neuroscience, and I think it needs more funding because it's far more complicated than we thought. We thought when we look in brains, we see neurons and synapses, and there's 86 billion neurons and roughly the same number of glial cells and trillions of synapses. That's complicated, but it turns out that's trivial compared to what's beyond it. That's just a VR headset to something deeper. The neurons are just the headset version of a deeper reality that we as scientists need to understand. So we need more money for neuroscience, not less, because we're just scratching the surface of what's going on when we look inside brains. So that changes the whole game for consciousness because my friends and colleagues, and I'm friends with most of the people in this field, or colleagues certainly, who are studying consciousness, most of them assume that physical systems like brains or AIs, with the right either functional properties or causal structure and so forth, that substrate with the right causal structure or functional properties, somehow the unconscious system gives rise to consciousness. Like the unconscious uh, system of neurons in the brain and their whatever pattern of activity they have, whether it's a causal thing or a functional thing, that gives rise to consciousness. And what I'm saying is our best science, evolution by natural selection, is telling us that space-time isn't fundamental, and objects inside space-time are simply icons in a VR headset that we're somehow creating. So that whole approach now, which is the approach that I first thought was the right approach. I mean, I went into the field thinking we're going to find the neural basis of consciousness. I now think that it's not going to work. Now, of course, I think we need to study neuroscience, and we need to study the neural correlates of consciousness. Absolutely, I'm all for that. But the direction of explanation is going to go the other way. Instead of explaining consciousness in terms of neurons, we're going to have to have a theory of consciousness itself that explains why we see things that we call neurons and glial cells when we look inside what we call brains. So it's going to have to go the other way. So again, I'm a small minority. I would say 98, 99% of my colleagues and friends who are studying consciousness are physicalists, functionalists, or you're like in the case of IT, they're saying some kind of substrate, um, some physical substrate with some kind of causal structural organization, that somehow then is either gives rise to or is identical to, explanatorily identical to consciousness. And I'm saying there is no substrate to consciousness, no physical substrate to consciousness. What we call the physical world is nothing but a headset inside consciousness. So to just see how dramatic the change is, most of us, myself included, have think of ourselves as tiny little objects in a vast space-time, billions of light years across. The nearest galaxy is 2.4 million light years away, and that's the nearest galaxy. And they go off. It's just like, so I'm just this little tiny, tiny, trivial little chunk of matter in this vast, billions of light years across universe, space-time. That's the way I thought. And now what I'm realizing is the other way around. Space-time is a tiny little data structure in my consciousness, and I create it on the fly as I need. So it's a so so that's how outrageous what I'm saying is. It's not small. Now,
Sorry. I just want to quickly ask there, Donald, how has that change in perception changed how you felt in the world? Because that's a massive flip on understanding who you are.
well, it's caused a big conflict in me because we're all just born knowing that we're little tiny objects in a big space-time. That's the reality that we just know we are. It's there's no question about it. And in fact, Piaget talks about object permanence. Little children he thought at 18 months they get object permanence. Later research showed it's more like 3 or 4 months. We're born to believe that objects exist whether or not they're perceived. My teddy bear, when you put it behind a pillow, still exists, and I believe that there's nothing that disappears in reality when it disappears from my sight. And so letting go of object permanence is letting go of something I was wired to believe at 4 months of age. So it's not trivial. So what I find is really interesting to see in myself when I'm thinking clearly about it, and I look at our best theories of evolution, and I'll mention physics in a moment because I'm treading on their territory clearly. So I'll talk about what the physicists say. But when I look at what our best science is saying, it looks to me like, yeah, space-time is not fundamental. And therefore, objects in space-time do not create my consciousness. It must be the other way around. But when I am not thinking, my natural reaction is to go back and I'm just a little tiny 160-pound body in space-time, and and what I see is the truth, and so forth. So it's really, so I do meditate, and that's helping me to let go of my prior assumptions. But I must say they don't go quietly. So when people look at what I say and say that's complete nonsense, I say I completely agree. It feels like nonsense to me too. Emotionally, it feels like complete nonsense what I'm saying. But that's what science is about. Science is taking our best ideas, making them absolutely precise, and then following wherever it leads, even if we don't like where it leads. And so that's what we have to do.
And just to emphasize what we're essentially saying here is that if you accept evolution and mathematics as true, if you accept those two things as true, then you also have to accept, or not have to accept, but it's also true that the reality we see is an illusion. We're not actually seeing what's there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would, yes, and I would just make a slight thing. I don't need to claim that evolution is true. All I need to do is say it's the best theory we have so far,
Okay.
right? So,
So, but if you accept evolution, then you have to accept this as well.
evolution entails this. Now, I should say that there is an issue that's been raised by philosophers that I should mention here. So, a number of philosophers, and I won't mention them by name, um, I don't want to impugn anybody, have published papers where they say that what I've just argued is logically self-contradictory. And the argument they give is this. They say, look, Hoffman is saying that he's used evolutionary game theory to show that space-time and its physical objects are not fundamental, that they're not, what we see is just an illusion. It's not fundamental reality. Now, Darwin's theory assumes that objects in space-time, like organisms and resources, are fundamental. That's what his theory assumes. So he's assuming that space-time and its physical objects are fundamental. Now, the argument that philosophers give is this. Either the mathematics of evolutionary game theory faithfully represents Darwin's ideas, or it does not. Now, if it does not, then Hoffman, of course, wouldn't want to use it to try to prove anything about what Darwin's theory entails. So, and if evolutionary game theory mathematics does faithfully represent Darwin's ideas, then it couldn't possibly contradict his assumption that physical objects like organisms and resources exist and are real. So either way, Hoffman's shot himself in the foot logically. What they like to say is he's in an unfortunate dialectical situation, but basically he's so stupid he shot himself in the foot logically. So and this is more than one philosopher has actually published this argument. So this is and I think then other philosophers I've talked with say, yeah, I buy that argument. So here's why the argument is false. It misunderstands scientific theories. What is a scientific theory? Scientific theory says, please grant me these assumptions. And if you grant me these assumptions, then I can explain all this other wonderful stuff. Very, very simple. Assumptions and then explanations. What this means is there cannot possibly be a scientific theory of everything because you don't explain your assumptions. You assume them. You don't explain them. So now you can say, well, I can give you a new, deeper theory that explains the assumptions of your previous theory. Yes, you can. And your new theory will have its own new assumptions. And this goes on ad infinitum. So this is horrible news for those who want a theory of everything in science. There is no such thing. It's great news for job security for scientists. It means that we will never, ever be done. We will always be building new theories. And what this means about any scientific theory is that it has, if it's a good theory, it has a certain scope of explanation. But it also means that it will have definite limits. No scientific theory is a theory of everything. So it will have limits. So a good theory gives you the mathematical tools to explore its scope. A great theory gives you the mathematical tools to discover its limits. So Einstein's theory of space-time, both special and general relativity. One of the key ideas is that the speed of light is the same for all observers, and the laws of physics are the same in all reference frames. And so Einstein is using, his assumption is that space-time is fundamental, either flat space-time or curved space-time. But space-time is fundamental. And then he writes down all sorts of interesting equations, the Lorentz transformations on the one in this flat space and the equations of general relativity in the curve. Now you might say, okay, well, is Einstein's theory just a good theory or is it a great theory? Does it have the tools to actually show the limits of the very concept of space-time itself? And it turns out, to Einstein's dismay, it's a great theory. What we discovered is that Einstein's theory, together with just another thing that Einstein came up with, energy is proportional to the frequency of a particle, entails that space-time falls apart at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and 10 to the minus 43 seconds at the Planck scale. So Einstein's own mathematics is good. It tells you the scope, the incredible scope of his mathematics of space-time.
Sorry, Donald, can I just ask you to sort of confirm what you mean by space-time falls apart at that figure? What does that actually mean that it falls apart at that scale?
It means that space-time has no operational meaning. There's no experiment that you can do that would have any outcome if you're trying to measure things that's smaller than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters or 10 to the minus 43 seconds. And the problem is this, as you go to smaller and smaller scales of space, how do you do that? Well, you have to get bigger and bigger microscopes to look smaller and smaller. Well, what does that mean? It means that you're effectively using smaller and smaller wavelengths of light or some kind of radiation, but let's talk about light. You have to get the wavelengths smaller and smaller and smaller to resolve smaller and smaller things in space-time. And that's fine. Quantum mechanics allows you to do that, but Einstein told us that E equals h nu. As you get the smaller and smaller wavelengths, the energy is going up. Then Einstein also told us that energy equals mass. So the mass is going up. You're getting more and more energy, therefore more and more mass inside a smaller and smaller region of space. And then general relativity kicks in and gives you a black hole at some point. And so at that, when you get to 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, the very thing you're trying to say, measure some tiny, tiny particle. Well, by the time you get to 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, you destroy whatever you're trying to measure. You turn it into a black hole. And if you get frustrated and say, well, I'm going to try to a smaller wavelength and put more energy into it, the black hole just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So space-time, there's literally no meaning that you can give to 10 to the minus 36 centimeters. Has no meaning. There's nothing you can do there. It literally has no operational meaning. So Einstein's own mathematics that Einstein himself wrote down to model his intuitions about space-time come back and tell us the limits of Einstein's very fundamental concept of space-time itself. It says that concept is fine as long as you're dealing with stuff bigger than 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. At 10 to the minus 33 centimeters and smaller, space-time falls apart. By the way, that's pretty shallow. It's 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, not 10 to the minus 33 trillion centimeters, just 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. So space-time, it turns out in Einstein's theory, is a very, very shallow data structure, a really, really shallow data structure. But this is how science works. You take your intuitions, you turn them into a mathematical theory. If the theory is a good theory, it allows you to explore the scope of the theory. Like GPS comes out of, the technology GPS depends on certain features of Einstein's theory of general relativity. But if it's a great theory, then the theory will actually give you the tools to find the limits of that theory. So now to come back to the philosophers' arguments against me. They're saying, again, their argument is that, Hoffman's using the mathematics of evolutionary game theory to show that the very fundamental concepts of Darwin cannot be fundamental. They're going to have to let go of those at some point. They're not fundamental to the nature of reality. And they're saying, I'm shooting myself in the foot. You couldn't possibly do that. And what I'm saying is, no, what you're missing is this is the way science works. The good science takes mathematical theories and uses the mathematics to find the limits of those theories so that we don't get stuck in a rut with one theory. It allows us to go beyond. So I'm not shooting myself in the foot. I'm just doing what science has to do. Now, what the old theory can't do is tell you what you should do next. Once you found the limit, and once we know that space-time isn't fundamental, and you say, okay, so, well, what's outside of space-time? And what could that even possibly mean? To say that there's something outside of space-time? Isn't everything inside space-time? What could you possibly be meaning? Well, space-time itself isn't going to tell you because space-time has its set of assumptions, namely that space-time is fundamental. Well, what you're now questioning is that. You're saying space-time isn't fundamental. So I've got to step outside of Einstein's set of concepts to get a new set of concepts. And the restriction then will be whatever new theory I come up with, it has to give me back Einstein's theory of space-time as some special projection. And by the way, physicists are already doing this. So the European Research Council in the last few months announced a 10 million euro project called Universe Plus. And the goal of that is to find the new mathematical framework for physics. And the framework, they're saying, beyond space-time and beyond quantum mechanics. And the reason they're doing this is that roughly 10 years ago, 11 years ago, they discovered these structures they call positive geometries entirely outside of space-time, entirely beyond quantum mechanics. There are no Hilbert spaces in these structures. So there's no quantum mechanics, there's no Hilbert spaces. but they give rise to the right answers to scattering experiments, like particles in the Large Hadron Collider smashing into each other, gluons smashing in and gluons spraying out, and so forth. You get the right answers. The math becomes much easier when you let go of space-time. Math, not to say that it's easy, but much easier than when you do it in space-time, and you see new symmetries. So they've been discovering just in the last decade, physicists have been, and I should say, high-energy theoretical physicists. Many physicists who aren't high-energy theoretical physicists don't even know about this. I mean, I've talked with many quantum theorists, for example, who simply don't know about this. So it's a small branch, but it's those physicists who are dealing with the edges of space-time's abilities, right? The high-energy theoretical physicists are the ones who are probing physics where space-time starts to fall apart. And so they're the ones that are moving out to these new structures beyond space-time called positive geometries and something called decorated permutations. So it's not just some cognitive scientist saying we need to do this. The ERC is funding this to the tune of 10 million euros. They had in February their first meeting with over 100 mathematicians and mathematical physicists on board to launch this new field of positive geometries outside of space-time. So yes, we can go outside of space-time. It seems like ridiculous. What could you even be talking about? I've mentioned this to people and they have no idea what I'm even talking. What could possibly be meant by something outside of space-time? Space-time is everything. Nope. That's a conceptual dead end. Thinking of space-time as everything is a conceptual dead end. We can, in fact, use mathematics and go entirely outside of space-time.
And just to emphasize what we're talking about here, in your last conversation with us with Anil Seth as well, you mentioned that what would have taken pages and pages and pages of mathematical equations using the framework of quantum physics or space-time, you can get the same result or a better result using like maybe a few lines of
Right. One
equations
page,
using
four or five terms on a page that you can write down by hand and compute by hand. The other, you couldn't even do it with supercomputers. This you can do by hand. That's pretty crazy. So, and the implications then for consciousness are almost all of my colleagues are assuming that space-time is fundamental and that objects in space-time are fundamental. They're looking for a physical substrate in space-time that's prior to consciousness. Now, it may be prior in the sense that it has the right causal structures as an integrated information theory, or it might be prior in the sense that it has the right functional properties, as most physicalist theories are. But in any case, what they're assuming, either an integrated information theory or global workspace theory or higher order theories or orchestrated collapse of quantum states of neuromicrotubules like Penrose and Hameroff. These theories are all assuming that space-time and certain physical substrates or objects inside space-time are fundamental and consciousness emerges. And that now is simply ignoring what physics has revealed. Space-time is not fundamental, and the substrates, namely the physical objects inside space-time, are not fundamental. And ERC and hundreds of brilliant high-energy theoretical physicists are now finding these new structures beyond space-time. The field of consciousness studies is now lagging behind. We are basing all of our research on a outmoded model of reality. It's gone. So there's no hope of booting up consciousness from neural activity or from the causal structure of substrates inside space-time or the functional properties of substrates inside space-time. It's not possible. Why? Because space-time itself is merely a trivial and shallow data structure and the objects inside of it. For example, what are particles? When you ask what is a physical particle, like a quark, bosons, leptons, and quarks, the elementary particles of the Standard Model, physicists will tell you that they're just irreducible representations of the group of symmetries of spacetime. If you give me a spacetime, its symmetries dictate the properties of its particles and what the particles are. So the particles themselves, when spacetime is doomed, so are the particles. because they're just representations of the symmetries of space-time. So we're trying to boot up consciousness from the particles, complicated assemblies of particles that are just representations of a space-time that is itself a shallow data structure, not the truth. So the whole enterprise of trying to build consciousness from some physical substrate, either a causal substrate or a functional substrate, is doomed. And the physicists are the ones who are telling us that. And I'm saying also that evolution by natural selection, Darwin's theory agrees. When you use evolutionary game theory, it agrees. So the main pillars of modern science, high energy theoretical physics, quantum field theory, together with Einstein's theory of gravity, and then Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection are both they're our greatest theories because in some sense they have the mathematics that tells us space-time was a wonderful framework for centuries, and it's over. It's time to get a new and deeper framework. And for better or for worse, what I'm trying to do is get a mathematical model of consciousness, qua consciousness outside of space-time. And my goal is to show that, so it's like a social network of interacting consciousnesses. So the mathematics is network theory. Very much, it's all about networks, the mathematics of networks, and stochastic processes on networks. That's the work that we're doing. And what we're trying to do is show mathematically that the positive geometries and the decorated permutations that the high energy theoretical physicists have found outside of space-time actually are projections of the network properties of an even bigger dynamics of conscious agents. So the physicists are going from space-time outward, and they're finding when we take off the space-time headset, what do we see? We see positive geometries. Well, who ordered that? This little, I mean, we take off our headset and what do we see? It's like in 2001, A Space Odyssey, the movie, right, where there's an obelisk and all the apes are hooting and hollering and pounding on, they know it's important. It's really pregnant with me, but they have no idea what it means. Well, that's where we are. We've taken off our headset. We look outside of space-time. What do we see? Obelisks, these geometric objects. They're static geometric. That's these positive geometries are really like the amplituhedron, the icosahedron, cosmology, like polytopes and so forth. These are like obelisks outside of space-time and they're sitting there, sort of staring at us silently. And what do they mean? The physicists, there's no dynamics. It's just these objects sitting there. Who ordered that? And then these permutations, these decorated permutations that classify the objects. So what we're saying is, well, we need a dynamical system outside of all of this. Yeah, how about a network of conscious agents interacting? We've made the map. We've made the map into the decorated permutations. We're working on the positive geometries.
A lot of this revolves around your theory of conscious agents as well. What is a conscious agent in really simple terms? Like, how would you describe that to someone hearing that for the first time?
That's right. So our proposal then is that space-time is doomed. So space-time can't boot up consciousness. Why don't we start with consciousness being fundamental? Let's have a theory where consciousness is fundamental. No substrates. No substrates whatsoever. Consciousness just is the fun. So if you're thinking about making a theory of consciousness, you might say, well, there's lots of stuff that theory has to do. There's qualia, there's choice, there's learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence, the self. There's tons and tons of stuff. What are you going to do? How do you build a theory of consciousness that's not coming emerging from some substrate, either causally or functionally? So what we are doing is what you have to do with any science. Pick the minimal assumptions, because the more you assume, the less you explain. So you want, this is Occam's razor. Do it with as little as possible. So we chose two things. There are experiences. So we're just saying there are, the taste of chocolate, the smell of garlic, the color red. That's our fundamental furniture of our universe. Not a space-time universe, something a universe outside of space-time. There are experiences and experiencers, having those experiences, and there are probabilistic relationships among experiences. That's it. What if I experience red? What's the probability that I might experience green next? That's it. No notion of self, learning, memory, problem solving, intelligence. We don't assume any of that. Just So if people want to see the math, we have a paper called Objects of Consciousness. You can just Google Objects of Consciousness. The math is there. Also, fusions of consciousness. They're free online, so you can see what we're doing. And it turns out that we get a social network of interacting conscious agents. The I'll just say one sentence of math for those who want a little bit of beef. The we model the spaces of possible experiences with probability spaces, measurable spaces, and the interactions, the probabilistic interactions among experiences with Markovian kernels. So, and it turns out our network model is computationally universal. So it means even though we don't assume learning, memory, problem solving, and so forth, we can build models of agents that only have our two little assumptions, experiences and probabilistic relationships among experiences. We can build models of learning, memory. Anything you can do with neural nets, you can do with conscious agent nets. They're equally powerful as neural nets. So we have networks of conscious agents, but the key difference is neural nets are inside spacetime. They're networks of physical objects inside spacetime. Conscious agent networks are networks of consciousnesses that have no physical substrate and are entirely outside of spacetime, and that create spacetime as one of the more trivial user interfaces that they use to interact with each other. So what we countenance is that our spacetime, three dimensions of space, one dimension of time, is a fairly trivial headset that some conscious agents use to interact, right? Think about it like the Twitterverse. There are millions of users and billions of tweets. There's no way that anybody could read all the tweets or interact with all the users. So we have to have something that to calm things down, to make it understandable. And so we'll look at trends and so forth. But ultimately, what we'd like to have is some kind of like headset that allows us to see what's happening in Wisconsin versus Tokyo or whatever. And that's what space-time is. It's just a little headset, a little data compression scheme and data understanding scheme that some conscious agents use to understand their interactions with others. But I don't see any reason that is special. In fact, it seems to me one of the more trivial headsets. Why not have 50 dimensions of space? Why not have 50 billion? Why be stuck with space at all? So I think that once we get rid of our blinders and our addiction to space-time, which we're born with, so I understand how hard it is to get rid of it. But once we let go of that, then our scientific creativity can go where we want.
Okay, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this. So are we almost saying that a conscious agent exists beyond space-time, but uses space-time as a way to interact with other conscious agents in the same way that somebody with a virtual reality headset can interact with somebody in a game in another part of the world, for example? Is this what we're saying here?
That's exactly right. So that conscious agents themselves are the fundamental idea, and there's essentially an infinite collection of these conscious agents that interact. And we're writing a paper right now on a logic that ties them all together. So so many spiritual traditions have an idea of one God or one Brahman or whatever they might want to call it, right? Some ultimate consciousness. And it turns out when we look at our conscious agents, we're starting off with little trivial ones like this conscious agent has only one experience. It can only see red. That's all it can do. And this conscious agent, maybe it sees red and green, and this one has 20 experiences, and that one has 50, and we can and so any experience that you can imagine, we can write down a probability structure for it and a Markovian dynamics for it, and we can have these interact. And when they interact, they can combine. You can take simpler agents and they combine in interesting ways to create more complicated agents. And so we get this combination logic that comes out of it. And we found in studying this, we found a new mathematical logic on Markov kernels, the Markov chains that we're about to publish. It turns out that there's a logic on all possible Markov dynamics that hadn't been discovered before. It's a trace logic, for those who know about trace chains, I'll just give the definition. One kernel is less than another if it's the trace of the other. That turns out that one definition gives you a non-Boolean logic of all the Markovian kernels, which in our case gives us a non-Boolean logic of all possible consciousnesses. And what it does is it says because it's non-Boolean, there's no single top consciousness. So there's not what most people would think of as God. Instead, it's far more interesting. There are an infinite number of directions in which you can go infinitely far in more and more complicated consciousnesses. So there's not one top direction, there's an infinite number of directions. And for me, if anything sounds closer to what I would think of by the meaning of God, that is much closer to than just having one little thing at the top, having an infinite number of directions. So, and by the way, I'm not smart enough to think of this. It was the mathematical logic of the trace order that forced me to let go of my baby thoughts about bigger and bigger consciousness, and it forced me to think in this new way. So that's the goal of science, is to get us out of our dogmatic slumbers and our old ways of thinking, and then force us, kicking and screaming sometimes, to see a bigger picture. And that's what this is doing.
Okay. Um, so just to clarify, so each one of us would potentially then be a conscious agent, which means that, and if that's the case, does that mean that on some level we each exist outside of space time as well? And this, what we're doing right now, is a sort of like temporary uh illusion of a deeper reality.
That's right. So you are a conscious agent, but you're also two conscious agents. If we cut your corpus callosum in half, you have two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, and they're connected by a band of about 220 million axons called the corpus callosum. And a friend of mine, Joe Bogan, was a surgeon who, to help people with epilepsy, sometimes had to go in and cut the corpus callosum and separate the two hemispheres. That helped with some problems with epilepsy. But what they found when they studied these people was that the right hemisphere, you could talk to just the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere. And in one person, for example, I think the right hemisphere was an atheist and the left hemisphere believed in God. And the right hemisphere wanted to be a race car driver. The left hemisphere wanted to be a draftsman, have a desk job. So, and the two hands, it turns out the right hemisphere controls the left hand and the left hemisphere controls the right hand. And sometimes the two hands fought. They would fight with each other because maybe the person was making an omelet and one hemisphere wanted to have an egg and the other one didn't want to have an egg and would try to ruin the omelet so it wouldn't be able to be cooked. So you're one conscious agent, but apparently we have evidence that you're also two. But I think that you're infinitely many, but potentially infinitely many conscious agents. Yeah, there's this whole network of interacting conscious agents. And at the same time, you are the one with the whole. Maybe I shouldn't call it the one, but maybe the whole consciousness. In some sense, you are the whole consciousness looking at itself through a particular trivial space-time headset, and your body is just a little avatar in that VR through which you're looking. So this changes the whole thing around. Instead of you are your body and your brain is the source of your consciousness, it's the other way around. Your consciousness is fundamental, and what you call your body and your brain is merely an avatar that you render when you need it. Is like an avatar in a virtual reality game is it's not you, and it only the hands that you see only exist when you look. If you don't look at the hands, those pixels are gone, and then there are no hands. There's no hands in the computer. So to be very, very explicit and maybe to shock people, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but I'll say this: neurons do not exist when they're not perceived, because nothing inside space-time exists when it's not perceived. Space-time itself does not exist when it's not perceived. It is only a data structure that exists when you create it in your consciousness. That's the shocking, and that's what I've been having a difficult time emotionally wrapping myself around. Intellectually, I'm there. The math has completely convinced me. Our best science convinced me this is true. We'll see when my emotions come along for the ride.
I have no idea how you get anything done knowing this. Like, just you must be just sitting all day, just going, can't believe this is actually true, you know? Um, but before we wrap up here, Donald, I was want to ask a question that I think is important to ask. If this is the case, um, why would consciousness exist? What might, or maybe the better question is, what do you see as the purpose of human existence then? Why would consciousness be having this experience through our eyes? In other words, like what might be going on there?
That's the fundamental, excellent question in this area. I started off by talking about how science, there's no theory of everything, no set of concepts, no set of theories can ever explain everything. And that's true of my own theory about consciousness, right? That's my theory of consciousness is a first trivial baby step. Consciousness is whatever it is. My theory is just a trivial theory, and it's the first of hopefully billions of successor theories. What this means about consciousness itself is consciousness transcends any description. What science does is build descriptions from certain perspectives. That's what we do as scientists. We take a perspective and we build a description. And so what this suggests is there's a deep answer to your question, and it comes, there's a theorem that no system can ever fully understand itself. If I have a computer, for example, and I want the computer to understand itself completely, what would I do? Well, I'd have it build a model of itself, right? Some software model of itself. Well, in the process, the computer itself has become more complicated because now it's the computer with a model. So now I'd have to model a computer with a model of it. And you can see this goes on ad infinitum. So it's pretty straightforward to see, maybe not to prove, but to see that no system can fully model itself. So tie that together with the fact that no theory of consciousness can ever get anywhere close to the complete explanation of consciousness. Consciousness, you are consciousness, and you transcend. So I'll be very personal. You transcend any scientific theory. Your consciousness transcends any scientific theory. So what is consciousness doing and why? What if consciousness, and first answer, I don't know. Here's a guess. Maybe it's educated, maybe it's uneducated, but it's a guess. Maybe what consciousness is up to is knowing itself. And the way it knows itself is to say, let me choose to project myself from this direction and look at myself from this direction. And when I do that, it looks like I'm this little thing called Don Hoffman that weighs 165 pounds, lives in Irvine and so forth. That's what I look like. But I'm just the universal consciousness looking at myself from this point, or I'm Neil, or I'm whoever I might be. That's what, and then I give myself 70, 80, 90 years, whatever it might be, to look at myself from that. And maybe to make it so that I really take that perspective seriously, maybe what I do is I let myself completely forget who I really am. Let me forget who I really am. Let me really believe that I'm 165 pounds of flesh in space and time, and really believe that, and really be worried about stuff, and so I really take this thing seriously, and then let me slowly wake up and and reap all the benefits that I got from that perspective. And that the entire life of Hoffman is one trivial perspective on who I really am. And each one of the billions of human beings is an important, but compared to the whole, trivial perspective on what the consciousness is. And so that's my best answer to your question, is that what consciousness is up to is trying on different avatars, trillions, quadrillions, uncountable numbers of, probably an infinity of different avatars. And the space-time headset that we're using is, as I've said, probably one of the more trivial ones. We're probably really low on the totem pole of avatars that consciousness is using. Very low right now. you know, we were like amoebas, it was really low on that. So, but there are other avatars with other perspectives that are much more complicated than ours. So in this case, in that perspective, it's no surprise that I'm having a hard time with this because the whole point was to give myself a hard time. So I would take this whole thing seriously and really take this perspective and wake up from it painfully. And then realize that death isn't the end. It's just taking off the headset.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a great note to end on, Don. Where can people find you online? Where would you recommend them to go after this conversation?
Well, for those who are technically minded, um, I have the objects of consciousness paper. So just Google objects of consciousness and fusions of consciousness, and then you can Google Scholar me. You can if you do Google Scholar and type in my name, you can see the other papers that we've done on this. By the way, if you have a recent PhD in mathematics and in uh, algebraic geometry, and you know these positive geometries, I have a postdoc. I have two postdoc positions that I'm advertising right now for. So I want someone within 2 years of a PhD in algebraic geometry so email me at ddhoff@uci.edu and I'll point you to where you can apply for a postdoc. We want someone who, again, a recent PhD in algebraic geometry, last 2 years, to work with us on this. And for those who are interested in less technical things, I would just say that I have a Twitter feed. So if you Don Hoffman, the DonHoffman, I forget what it's called. My Twitter handle. I can send it to you. My Twitter handle. So I do post stuff that I'm thinking about, and I post videos like this one. I'll post when it comes out, if you allow me, and YouTube videos and so forth. So so yeah, I guess yeah, my online YouTube stuff. Oh, and I have a book, The Case Against Reality, for those who want to look at the evolution argument in more detail and see more of the guts of that. And I talk a little bit about consciousness in that as well. So,
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, another thing I mentioned to you before recording, before we started recording, was that I think what you're essentially doing, I know this isn't your intention, and it's sort of just happening as a byproduct, but you are opening the possibility of mystery in the world and a sense of spirituality in the world to people that
mm.
otherwise might not be able to access it, and I think that's super, super important. People that are very sort of intellectual and interested in mathematics and physics and everything else as well, spirituality is not accessible to them, but through someone like yourself, then they can get in touch with this very, very important thing in life. So I think it's super important what you're doing, and um, obviously just keep going, and best luck with everything going forward too.
Thank you very much. And I agree that ultimately, I think there'll be a very profitable interaction between science and spirituality because mystery is at the heart. Science tells us that there is no theory of everything. It's very, very clear there's no theory of everything. That means at the core is a deep, deep mystery. And you are that mystery. You are not separate from the mystery. You are that mystery. So I agree with you that science and spirituality, it will be difficult. There's a lot of bad history between them, but I think eventually it will be a very, very profitable interaction.
Thank you, Donald.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. If you'd like to hear the full version, you can do so with the Weekend University Premium membership. This gets you access to our mastered library of over 5 years of psychology conferences, including over 230 talks and interviews with the world's leading psychologists, professors, and authors, unlimited CPD certification, transcripts, quizzes, premium passes for our annual conference, online courses with Richard Schwartz and Deb Dana, and more. The cost is £97 for 1 year, which breaks down at around 27p per day. The best bit is you can try it out for 30 days completely risk-free, as all orders come with a 100% money-back guarantee. If you're interested, please go to twmembers.com for more information.